They took her bag like it was garbage, flung it to the side in front of a full boarding gate, without a word, without hesitation, like she didn't belong there, like her presence was some kind of mistake carved in skin. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, frozen between rows of polished shoes and expensive coats, watching as something far more than luggage was discarded in that moment. No one stepped in. No one asked her name. To them, she was just another black woman out of place, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. But what no one knew, what not a single soul standing in that gate could have imagined, was who she truly was, what she represented, and what it would cost them to treat her like less. This isn't just about one flight. It's about power, silence, and the storm that rises when the person you try to erase becomes the one writing your fate. If that caught your breath, like this video, subscribe for the full unraveling, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you saw this unfold in front of you? The terminal air was cool and humming, a mixture of travel-weary silence and the rhythmic announcements crackling through overhead speakers. Gate C-17 displayed its clean digital signage. First-class priority boarding, a label that was supposed to evoke privilege, comfort, and exclusivity. Liana Booker stood at a polite distance from the queue, her boarding pass ready, her posture straight, her chin neither high nor low, perfectly centered in the calm confidence she had cultivated over years of entering rooms not built with her in mind. She was dressed in tailored slacks and a fitted aubergine coat, its collar brushed neatly against her neck. In one hand, she held the handle of her modest yet unmistakably fine leather carry-on, the kind of bag that didn't shout luxury but whispered it through perfect seams and subtle detailing. Her gloves, folded neatly, peeked from her coat pocket. She didn't smile, but her face rested in that neutral expression shared by seasoned travelers, the kind who knew not to expect kindness or cruelty, only process. When the announcement for first-class boarding began, Liana moved forward with measured ease. As she approached the gate, the attendant glanced up from her tablet. Ellen, late 40s, pale foundation powdered thick across her face, took in Liana's appearance in a single trained glance. The shift in her expression was almost imperceptible, but Liana saw it. A tightening of the lips, a faint pause in breath. Without waiting for Liana to offer her pass, Ellen reached forward and rested a hand on the carry-on. The act was gentle, but unmistakably proprietary. Liana's brow lifted a fraction, just enough to register surprise. Ellen didn't speak. She turned and handed the bag to another airport staff member in a red vest who had approached without being summoned. The man took the bag and disappeared down the jet bridge without explanation, without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of a nod. Liana opened her mouth to question, to assert, to ask, but no sound came out. She felt an unexpected hesitation rise in her throat, not fear, but something adjacent to weariness, the kind built over time through experiences just like this one, in places just like this, by people just like Ellen. Ellen finally scanned the boarding pass with an almost theatrical slowness. Her eyes didn't meet Liana's, but her voice was clipped, businesslike. Boarding confirmed. First row. Center aisle. No apology. No mention of the bag. Liana said nothing as she stepped onto the jet bridge, the silence of the corridor broken only by the rolling of suitcases behind her. She walked alone, the taste of insult bitter in her mouth, but not yet defined. Her seat, 1D, was near the front, separated by only inches from the cockpit wall. She slid into the high-backed leather seat and tried not to let her mind dwell on what had just happened. Maybe it was protocol. Maybe they were rushed. Maybe the bag had looked too heavy or too large, or perhaps it was just easier for them to act without asking when the passenger didn't look like someone who'd complain. Her thoughts barely had time to settle before a new face appeared beside her. A male flight attendant, younger, clean-shaven, clipboard in hand. His tone was friendly, almost apologetic, as he leaned slightly closer and explained that there had been a seating error, something about a manifest mismatch, and asked if she could please step back into the galley for a moment while they sorted it out. There was no offer of an explanation, no indication of what had gone wrong. Her boarding pass was clearly marked. The seat was clearly hers. She looked at him, but saw no space for refusal. So she stood, smoothed the front of her coat, and followed him. In the galley, she stood alone for 7 long minutes. The attendant disappeared behind a curtain and did not return. When she finally asked another crew member if there was an issue, she received only a vague response about digital redundancies and an upgraded ticketing conflict. She asked again more firmly. The attendant checked a screen, typed for a long time, then said something that wasn't quite an answer, but sounded official enough to deflect further questions. A new boarding pass was printed. The seat was not in first class, not even business. 33C last cabin, rear of the aircraft, middle seat. Liana stood still for a moment, boarding pass in hand, unsure whether to fight or comply. Her fingers curled slightly around the thin slip of paper. Her original seat had been 1D. She had booked it herself weeks ago at full fare. There had been no mistake, but she had also seen what happened to passengers who resisted too loudly. Her father had told her years ago, sometimes silence was safer than pride. So she turned and walked. The walk back was worse than she expected. Passengers in the early rows tilted their heads slightly, their eyes following her like searchlights. Some blinked with confusion, some with recognition, others with indifference. As she passed the row she had just occupied, the man now settling into 1D didn't even glance her way. He was already sipping sparkling water. She kept walking, past business, past premium, past the curtain that separated silence from static, past the aisle where snacks cost money and the air smelled less filtered. Row 33 was narrow, cramped, unforgiving. Her seat, 33C, was wedged between a man who had already removed his shoes and a woman with elbows like iron. The overhead bin was full. She had nothing to stow anyway. Her carry-on was gone. She didn't even know where. She lowered herself into the seat without comment, knees pressed into the plastic shell of the seat in front of her. The man beside her didn't move his arm off the shared rest. The woman beside her offered no space, no greeting, no glance. As the plane taxied, Liana leaned her head back and looked straight up, her eyes tracing the tiny air vents overhead. She breathed in slowly, out even slower. The captain's voice buzzed over the intercom, welcoming passengers, thanking them for choosing Skylux. She closed her eyes. She hadn't spoken since she had been displaced from 1D, and she had no plans to speak now. She had learned over time that silence was not just a choice, but a shield, one that made you smaller, quieter, harder to target. As the attendants moved down the aisle with the beverage cart again, their rehearsed smiles and quick gestures filling each row with plastic cups and packaged snacks, Liana found herself bracing, not in anticipation, but in resignation. When the cart reached her row, the same pattern repeated. The attendant offered a soda to the man on her left, water to the woman on her right. Liana's presence was bypassed entirely. She didn't raise a hand or a voice. Instead, she looked straight ahead, her eyes locked on the emergency procedures card jammed into the seat pocket in front of her, reading words she had memorized long ago simply to have something to focus on. She didn't need a beverage. She needed to endure. The flight was barely an hour into its scheduled 3, and the cabin had already begun to settle. Lights dimmed, shades pulled. The flight crew's smiles faded behind closed curtains near the front of the aircraft. She didn't sleep. Her mind was alert, not anxious, but painfully clear, every moment dissected and sorted. The confiscation of her bag, the absurd reassignment, the way the man now sitting in 1D had claimed her seat with effortless entitlement, his polished shoes already resting on the elevated footrest when she passed him. These things weren't accidents. They were patterns dressed in procedure, delivered with enough politeness to disarm protest, but precise enough to leave a scar. A sudden jolt in the cabin's rhythm brought her attention back. An older woman across the aisle called for assistance, complaining that her screen wouldn't work. The crew responded immediately, offering her another seat in the row ahead. When the exchange was complete, Liana noticed a crew member, Curtis, approaching from the front of the cabin. His face was familiar. He was the one who had handed her the new boarding pass. She watched him pause at the row just ahead of her, speak briefly with the passenger in the aisle seat, then step aside as the man stood and moved forward. Curtis then looked directly at Liana. For a moment, she thought he might finally address her, maybe explain, maybe even apologize. But his eyes slid past her like a hand brushing off lint, and he turned to leave without a word. 5 minutes later, the passenger who had been seated across from her returned, now holding a hot meal tray, a full dinner service, complete with silverware and warmed bread. As he sat down, he noticed her glance and gave her a half smile, perhaps meant to be kind. She looked away. The food wasn't the point. It never had been. The point was that she wasn't considered. She wasn't seen as someone who would complain or retaliate. She was the one they could practice their authority on without fear. The thought settled inside her like cold metal. The temperature in the cabin dropped slightly. The vent above her head still hadn't been adjusted. Liana tried once more to press the call button, her thumb hovering a moment before she pushed. The small orange light illuminated beside her seat. She waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The light eventually went out on its own. No one came. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a second service began. This time it was warm towels and headphones for premium economy. She watched the attendants moving efficiently, their hands practiced, their expressions blank. The man beside her, still reading, received a towel without asking. The woman on the window side stirred and adjusted her blanket. Liana's row was passed again. She wanted to say something. The words were forming behind her teeth, each one sharp and controlled. But she swallowed them. There was a kind of humiliation that came from being publicly shamed, and another more corrosive kind that came from being quietly ignored, methodically erased. That was the kind she knew best. It didn't scream. It smothered. It sat on your shoulders in silence and reminded you that you were allowed to exist, but not too much, not too close, not too loud. This flight, this row, this seat, it wasn't about seating algorithms or airline logistics. It was about someone deciding she didn't belong and others agreeing by doing nothing. When the pilot announced the beginning of descent, a soft murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers sat up straighter. Window shades were reopened. Liana kept her eyes closed, breathing evenly. Her shoulders ached from being held still for too long. Her legs were stiff. The man beside her yawned, stretched, and finally gave her a passing glance before returning to his phone. The woman on the right said nothing. As the cabin crew made final checks, a different attendant stopped at her row. She hadn't seen this woman before. Short, early 30s, tightly pulled hair. The woman looked at Liana's seatbelt and nodded. Then, she leaned slightly forward and asked in a low voice if Liana had been comfortable during the flight. It was not a question. It was a test. The kind of question that already assumed the answer was yes. Liana held her eyes for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded once. The woman moved on without comment. The wheels touched down harder than expected. A few gasps came from passengers unprepared for the jolt. Liana didn't move. As the plane taxied to the gate, the overhead lights came on. Row by row, passengers stood, reaching for their belongings. She remained seated. She had nothing to retrieve. Her carry-on was gone. Her dignity had been weighed and dismissed. When it was finally her row's turn to exit, the man to her left pulled his bag from the overhead bin and moved without a word. The woman beside her did the same. Liana rose slowly, stepping into the aisle. Her body was sore. Her pride ached, but her face remained composed. She walked forward past the rows of people eager to leave, eager to forget the discomfort of travel and return to something familiar. The terminal around her hummed with reunions, echoes of names called out, greetings in wide smiles and open arms. Liana walked through them like a ghost, untouched and uninvited. She found herself at a customer service station just beyond the security doors. No line, no wait, only a tired-looking agent typing behind a podium. Liana stepped forward, her voice measured, her question simple. She asked about the bag, provided her name, her seat number, her boarding confirmation. The woman behind the desk stared at her screen for a long moment, then replied that there was no record of a misplaced item and that the system showed no flag transfer for seat 1D. Liana asked again, calmly but firmly. The agent repeated the same statement, slower this time, with an edge of practiced finality. Liana's name wasn't in any flagged luggage report. Her bag wasn't logged as separated. It was as if the bag, like the seat, had never belonged to her. Liana left the counter without a thank you or farewell. She walked on, the distance from the service desk to the airport exit longer than she remembered, lined with advertisements promising comfort, luxury, and efficiency, none of which she had been granted. Outside, a black town car waited, driver in a dark coat holding a discreet sign with her last name. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, opened the door, and returned to the front seat. The ride to the hotel was silent except for the occasional blinker and hum of tires over asphalt. Liana sat straight in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. She didn't check her phone. She didn't review her itinerary. She allowed herself no distractions. Not yet. She needed the weight of what had just happened to settle completely before deciding what to do with it. At the hotel, the concierge greeted her with perfunctory courtesy, his smile brief and insincere. Her reservation was in order. A standard suite, city view. No upgrades available. No acknowledgement of status. No mention of loyalty tier. She accepted the room key, rode the elevator alone, and entered the room without turning on the lights. Only when the door clicked shut behind her did she finally let herself sit on the edge of the bed and breathe deeply. Her coat still clung to her shoulders. The room was warm but unfamiliar, sterile and dim, with furniture that felt temporary and surfaces that refused fingerprints. She sat for several minutes without moving, her body tense but her face unreadable. The next morning, the first sting came early. At the front desk, when she asked for an update on her luggage, the receptionist offered a confused look, checked the computer, and informed her that the airline claimed no responsibility. The report had been closed. Liana stood there, still and silent, processing the implications. No responsibility, no accountability. Her name removed, her presence rewritten. As she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, a bellhop nearby turned to watch her leave, his expression unreadable, his gaze lingering just a second too long. That day, she moved through meetings with quiet precision. Every handshake was firm, every presentation flawless. No one would have suspected the storm pressing in behind her composure. But every time she adjusted her blazer or reached into her replacement tote, she felt the ghost of her stolen bag, of her stolen place. That evening, during a dinner reception hosted on the hotel's rooftop terrace, she stood apart from the crowd near the railing, sipping still water from a clear tumbler. She was not in the mood for wine or small talk. The city below flickered with gold light and late traffic. Somewhere behind her, laughter rose in a burst from a cluster of executives. One of them, a woman with overstyled hair and a lanyard heavy with credentials, broke from the group and approached. She spoke with ease, making a passing comment about the view and how surprisingly warm the night was. Then she asked if Liana had flown in first class. The question was casual, harmless in tone, but Liana felt her pulse shift. She nodded once. The woman smiled and said something about how nice it was to see the company expanding its outreach to new markets. Liana said nothing. The woman went on about some internal initiative, something about visibility and diversity, before trailing off and returning to her circle. Liana turned her face back to the skyline and let the glass press cold against her lips. Later, in her room, she received a message from a hotel staff member that a package had arrived for her. When she opened it, it wasn't her bag. It was a thin envelope containing a note printed on airline letterhead. It read like a form apology, thanking her for flying and acknowledging a logistical complication during her previous flight. No specifics, no ownership, no reference to the stolen item, no compensation. She folded the letter neatly and placed it on the desk beside the television. Her phone rang. A client wanting confirmation for the morning's itinerary. She responded clearly, firmly, professionally. As always. She did not mention the letter. She did not mention the flight. The client hung up with a thank you and good night. She stood by the window for a long time after that, watching the city, feeling the way invisibility could cling to someone like a second skin. Not obvious, not dramatic, just persistent. Persistent in every gesture, every erasure, every calculated shrug of indifference. She did not cry. She did not pace. She allowed the weight of it to sit with her, unchallenged, because she knew that naming it too early would give others a chance to explain it away. She would not give them that chance. She would wait. The car eased out into the morning traffic, and Liana glanced briefly out the window, her mind not on the buildings passing by, but on the carefully packaged envelope from the airline still resting in her room drawer. It hadn't moved. She had touched it only once, not to read it again, but to confirm it was real. The letter's emptiness spoke volumes. No mention of the seat, the crew, the personal bag, or the treatment that reduced her from a respected traveler to an invisible inconvenience. It wasn't that they didn't acknowledge her discomfort. It was that they refused to even admit she had been seen. At the summit, she entered the conference center through the side entrance, as she had the previous days. Her name had not been listed among the featured speakers, though her role as project consultant was the reason many of the conversations were taking place at all. She bypassed the registration table, not out of pride, but because she had already experienced the predictable discomfort of being asked, 3 times, if she was with catering or logistics. She took her seat near the stage, opened her notes, and prepared for the first panel. Her contributions were punctual, thorough, and unquestionable. No one interrupted her. No one dismissed her ideas. But neither did they linger to speak with her after. While the other speakers received handshakes and congratulations, she received nods of recognition that dissolved before they reached her name. The praise came in fragments, filtered through supervisors or colleagues who took credit by proximity. She didn't correct them. She simply watched, noted, and filed the truth away. Lunch was served on the rooftop garden, with white tablecloths and soft jazz. Liana stood near a small table by the railing, sipping sparkling water and observing the polite chaos around her. People mingled in neat clusters, laughter punctuating the flow of conversation. She remained alone, not by design, but by expectation. A few glanced her way, their gazes sliding past her as though she were scenery. She didn't try to join any circle. She had tried that the first day. Now she stood still, calm, deliberate, watching the way inclusion moved through the space without touching her. Her solitude wasn't caused by conflict. It was enforced by design. She knew the difference. The meal was catered by an upscale kitchen, servers dressed in crisp black and white uniforms circulating with trays. When a server passed by with a fresh platter, he paused near her, looked her up and down briefly, then offered the tray to someone standing behind her. She watched the entire motion, her body unmoving, her expression set in the same unreadable line. The tray moved on without her. As the afternoon session began, Liana returned to her seat, nodding briefly to a few familiar faces who returned her greeting with polite silence. She presented again, answered questions clearly, and provided supporting documentation for memory. Every word she spoke carried weight, but every nod of agreement passed over her to someone else. She was not thanked. She was not mentioned. At the session's end, the audience applauded, and she remained in her seat while the others stepped forward to shake hands and pose for photos. A photographer passed by, paused briefly, then continued without raising his camera. The moderator walked up to her afterward and said he hadn't realized she would be there in person. She didn't correct him. She just smiled and walked away. Outside the center, a light drizzle had begun. The concrete shimmered under the dimming afternoon light. Liana walked slowly toward the street where her car waited. She didn't open an umbrella. She didn't speed up. Her thoughts weren't on the summit or the closing remarks. They were on the moment earlier that morning when she had checked her email and found no reply to her submitted incident report. No confirmation, no reference number, no acknowledgement. It was as though the system had swallowed it whole. She'd written it carefully, each word precise, each event documented chronologically. The flight, the seat, The reassignment, the treatment, the silence. Her fingers had trembled slightly as she typed, not from emotion, but from restraint, from the effort of filtering pain into facts. And yet nothing had come back. That evening, in her hotel room, Liana sat on the edge of the bed and called the airline's customer line again. After 10 minutes of automated prompts, she reached a live agent. She explained her situation again, calmly and clearly. The agent placed her on hold. After 12 minutes, he returned and told her that no case file could be found under her name. She repeated the flight number, the seat, the missing item. He asked if she was sure she hadn't checked the bag herself. Her voice tightened. She said no. She had never let it out of her hand until it was taken at the gate. He told her to try calling the airport directly. Then the line disconnected. She sat in silence. Outside, the rain picked up, tapping against the window with growing insistence. She stood slowly, walked to the desk, and opened her laptop. She drafted a new message, addressed this time not to customer service, but to a name she had found in a buried company directory, Vice President of Passenger Relations. She copied in timestamps, referenced security footage locations, and listed names of crew where available. She didn't ask for apology. She didn't ask for explanation. She asked for clarity, and she marked the message urgent. Then she sent it and closed the screen. She had received no follow-up to the letter she sent to the airline executive. She had not received word about her luggage. The only message in her inbox was a brief reminder of her itinerary and a final thank you for her service on the summit team, sent by an assistant who had misspelled her last name. Liana dressed carefully. Today, she would fly home. Her replacement bag, a temporary piece borrowed from the hotel's lost and found policy, was packed with the few items she had managed to gather over the week. A tablet, a notebook, a phone charger, a pair of flats she had purchased in a downtown shop because her own were gone. She wore a steel blue dress with a thin belt at the waist, her shoes polished, her coat pressed. She looked composed, but not extravagant. Respectable, professional, neutral. She always chose clothes that closed the gap between being noticed and being questioned. Not too loud, not too soft, not too casual, not too proud. Her driver arrived on time. The airport was 35 minutes away, traffic light but steady. She sat in the back, her tablet closed, her hands folded, her thoughts arranged in quiet sequence. At the terminal, the line for check-in was short. She approached the kiosk first, scanning her ticket. The machine blinked once, then requested assistance. A red light appeared on the screen. A nearby agent noticed and stepped over. The agent, a young man with tired eyes, asked for her name, which she gave. He typed slowly, frowning at the screen. After a moment, he told her she would need to see the desk. Her reservation was active, but something had flagged her boarding priority. She asked what the issue was. He didn't answer. She walked to the desk. At the counter, another agent repeated the same instructions. Her name had triggered a flag. A seating discrepancy, she was told. She explained that her ticket had been confirmed 2 weeks ago, paid in full, with a seat selection. She was told the system had reclassified her based on a cabin adjustment. She asked for clarification. The agent became vague, then impatient. Liana remained calm, but behind her eyes, the familiar coldness returned. The same sensation she had felt when her bag was taken at the gate. The same emptiness that followed her through the last row of the aircraft. She handed over her ID again. The agent typed something, frowned, and then printed a new boarding pass. Liana took it. Row 27, middle seat. Again, she said nothing. She turned and walked to security. The process was slow. She was stopped for a random screening. Her bag was emptied onto the metal table, her items inspected without urgency. The flat shoes, the notebook, the charger. Her tablet was held up and examined for longer than necessary. She stood quietly, watching as the agent's gloved hands moved through her possessions, as if searching for contraband rather than verifying electronics. Once cleared, her items were returned without apology. She packed them herself, zipped the bag, and moved on. At the gate, Passengers were already gathering. She took a seat near the edge of the seating area, away from the center noise. Her boarding group had been moved to Group 5, despite her original first-class status. She watched the screen change from red to green as priority passengers were called. Uniformed attendants checked names, smiled, and welcomed travelers with warm tones. When her group was called, she stood and waited in line. As she approached the gate, the attendant scanned her pass and hesitated. Something in her eyes shifted as she read the screen. She asked Liana to step aside. Liana did, without protest. A second attendant joined, whispering. There was a brief exchange. The first attendant turned back to Liana and asked her to wait. She did. Minutes passed. The final call announcement echoed through the terminal. Families rushed aboard. Flight crew prepared the final manifest. Then, without any further discussion, the attendant waved her through, handing back the boarding pass without eye contact. Liana walked down the jet bridge, the memory of every step of this routine now mapped with silent offense. Inside the plane, the lights were low. She reached row 27, slid into the middle seat between a teenage boy wearing headphones and a woman already asleep against the window. The tray table was sticky. The armrests were missing padding. The air was colder than usual. As the plane filled, the row behind her grew noisy with a group of travelers who seemed to know each other. They joked loudly, passed snacks, and leaned forward into her seat without acknowledgement. When she adjusted slightly to avoid contact, one of them laughed and mumbled something that she could not hear but fully understood. The attendant walked past, ignoring the exchange. When beverage service began, she was handed a lukewarm water bottle and a napkin with someone else's name printed on it. She held the items without expression. At cruising altitude, the attendants began handing out meal boxes. She was skipped entirely. When she asked quietly and politely if she could have one, she was told there had been a miscount. No extras were available. She watched as 2 boxes were later taken to the cockpit. 3 hours later, the plane began its descent. The captain thanked passengers for choosing the airline. The lights brightened. Liana closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. When they landed, the disembarkation was slow. People stood before the signal. Bags were yanked from overhead compartments. The noise of rushed conversations filled the cabin. She waited in her seat until the row ahead cleared. As she stood, a sudden lurch from someone behind her caused her to stumble slightly, pressing against the seat in front of her. No apology was offered. The passenger behind her smirked and said something under his breath. The others laughed. She ignored it. They didn't notice the growing tension in her spine, the moments she paused too long between words, or the way her eyes occasionally lost focus when she was supposed to be listening. And even if they had noticed, none of them would have known what to do with that awareness. This wasn't something easily defined. The cruelty she endured hadn't been loud or spectacular. It hadn't left bruises or cuts. It had left something quieter, something that curled in the back of her throat and pressed behind her ribs whenever she heard a voice that sounded like one of the flight attendants, whenever she smelled the recycled air of a building's HVAC system that reminded her of the cabin, whenever she spotted another passenger in a suit gliding into first class with no resistance at all. Her work demanded travel again within the week. Another flight, another airline. She booked it through the corporate system, this time marking all preferences manually to avoid errors. She double-checked every selection. C2A, first class, window. She printed the confirmation and tucked it into her folder, as if proof alone could protect her. On the morning of the flight, she arrived early, checked in at the kiosk, and made her way to the gate without interference. For a moment, she thought the experience would be different. Then, the boarding process began. First class was called. She stepped forward. The attendant at the podium looked at her pass, scanned it, and paused. Her name again triggered something on the screen. He asked her to wait. The woman behind her, blonde, blue scarf, brisk tone, was waved through with a smile. Liana stood in silence, her hands resting at her sides. The attendant turned to a colleague. They whispered. Then he looked back at her, and said the seat had been reassigned due to aircraft configuration. She asked for clarification. He said it was automatic. She asked if she was still in first class. He hesitated, then said she would be seated shortly. She was escorted down the jet bridge behind a crew member who didn't speak to her. When she reached the cabin, the attendant inside glanced at her pass, then led her past the first few rows. Again, seat 18B, middle. No apology, no eye contact, no explanation. She sat down slowly, adjusted her coat, and looked forward without blinking. The man beside her coughed repeatedly without covering his mouth. The woman beside him held a tablet at an awkward angle that pushed against Liana's side. She kept still. Her silence was a necessity now, a kind of armor. She was becoming used to these moments, and that scared her more than anything. The normalization of injustice. The routine violation of dignity delivered with practiced indifference. During the flight, the attendants passed by with snacks. The first time, she was bypassed completely. The second time, she was offered a packet of peanuts when the rest of the cabin was receiving hot sandwiches. She didn't ask for clarification. She accepted the peanuts, set them on her tray table, and didn't touch them. When the passenger next to her asked for extra napkins, he received 3. When she asked for 1, she was told they had run out. It wasn't about supplies. It was about perception. They didn't see her as deserving. And perhaps worse, they didn't fear consequence. She had become a target not just because of how she looked, but because of how little they assumed she could do in response. As the plane landed and passengers prepared to exit, she waited as always. She did not jostle for position or speak out of turn. When the man in the aisle seat stumbled slightly, catching himself on her shoulder, he said nothing. She didn't expect him to. As she walked off the plane, the lead flight attendant stood at the exit, thanking each passenger by name when possible. When Liana passed, she offered a brief nod. The attendant didn't respond. Behind her, another woman received a compliment on her shoes. The contrast was deliberate. Outside the gate, Liana paused at a quiet corner of the terminal to collect herself. Her hands were cold, though the air was warm. She reached into her folder and pulled out her printed confirmation. Seat 2A, still visible, unblemished. She stared at it. This paper meant nothing. It had never meant anything. It was merely a placeholder for an expectation that would not be honored. She tucked it away and walked toward ground transportation. That night, in her hotel room, she called the airline. She provided her name, her booking number, her seat confirmation. The voice on the other end sounded confused. The representative said the system showed she had been seated as scheduled. Liana corrected her. The representative asked for proof. Liana described the reassignment, the seat, the experience. The representative asked if she had spoken to a supervisor on the plane. Liana said no. The representative sighed and said she would file a note. No escalation, no investigation, just a note. The following morning, Liana walked into her client meeting wearing a black sheath dress and a dark gray blazer. Her heels clicked against the tile floor. Her voice was steady during the briefing. Her mind stayed sharp through the budget review. Her tone was firm in every negotiation. She succeeded in all objectives. She was praised by name in the closing remarks. But none of it washed away what had happened. None of it replaced the quiet wound of being treated like a mistake, a problem, an expendable presence. On her return flight, she tried again, booked again, verified again. Seat 3C, aisle. The process repeated. At the gate, she was reassigned to seat 22F. At first, she thought it was a glitch. Then she recognized one of the attendants from her previous flight. The same flat smile, the same quick deflection. She sat in 22F and watched as the new occupant of 3C, a man wearing a sports jacket and a baseball cap, stretched out comfortably and accepted a complimentary drink. No one mentioned her name. No one acknowledged the change. She knew then that this was not coincidence. This was not human error. This was deliberate. It had taken a few calls, a discreet referral, and an intentional silence about the details. But it was hers. The executive charter company had asked only for credentials, payment, and preferences. She provided them all. No questions were raised. No names mishandled. No reassignments. Yet even here, even now, a pulse of tension beat beneath her skin, the residue of repeated humiliation clinging to her body like a scent that wouldn't wash away. She walked through the terminal with composed precision, acknowledging the staff's soft greetings without offering conversation. At the security checkpoint, a woman in a black suit asked politely to verify her ID. Liana handed it over with a steady hand. The woman glanced at the name, paused, then looked up and nodded with what seemed to be genuine recognition. She returned the ID without hesitation and gestured her forward with quiet professionalism. It was not the reaction Liana expected. The waiting lounge was almost empty. Only one other passenger sat near the window reading a document, a man in his 60s wearing a dark tailored coat. He didn't look up. Liana sat across the room and opened her tablet, not to read, but to steady herself. The email from her counsel had arrived an hour earlier, confirming that the letter to the airline had been officially received and logged. The legal department had acknowledged the allegations, noting that an internal review was underway. They had not denied the facts. They had not issued apologies, but neither had they dismissed it. That alone was new. It was the first time in weeks her name had been treated as something more than a nuisance or a blank line on a passenger manifest. But that letter, precise, detailed, impossible to ignore, had done more than recount a series of violations. It had reminded them that she existed beyond the confines of their systems, beyond the protocols they bent to erase her. When her flight was called, a single staff member approached, addressing her directly by name. This time her full name, pronounced clearly, no hesitation, no abbreviation. She stood and followed him onto the tarmac, the private jet waiting with its sleek metallic body gleaming under the late morning sun. The steps were lowered, and as she climbed them, a sudden breeze pushed lightly at her coat, like the air itself was acknowledging her movement. Inside, the cabin was immaculate, the seats spacious and understated. She was offered water, a warm towel, and asked if she would prefer a window or aisle. She chose the window and sat in silence as the engines hummed to life. As the plane lifted off the ground, she looked down at the disappearing buildings and streets and let her thoughts drift not to the destination, but to the return she planned in quiet. What had begun as endurance was no longer just about survival. It was about confrontation. The silence she had used to protect herself was transforming. It was not retreat. It was reloading. And in that transformation, she was beginning to see the truth behind her own restraint. It had never been weakness. It had been strategy. Every insult, every denial, every redirection and dismissal had shaped the weapon she was now prepared to use. Her name, dismissed so easily by gate agents, erased by attendants, distorted in meeting agendas, was not just a name. It was a key. And once used, it would not be ignored. 3 days later, she arrived at the central headquarters of the airline under the pretense of a consulting meeting. The building was glass and steel, filled with curated lighting and open-plan spaces designed to look progressive. She walked through the doors wearing a tailored navy suit with a white blouse, her hair pinned back, her expression unreadable. A receptionist greeted her by her last name, then quickly apologized for not recognizing her title. Liana said nothing. She followed the escort to a private conference room on the executive floor. The space was cool and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows and untouched bottled water arranged at perfect angles. She sat at the head of the table, her documents aligned, her hands folded. 3 individuals entered: a senior legal officer, a vice president of operations, and a woman she recognized from a flight weeks ago, the one who had handed her the meal tray with someone else's name printed on the napkin. The introductions were slow. The conversation began with procedural language, questions about her experience framed with cautious neutrality. Liana let them speak. She let them circle around the facts, couching their language in hypothetical what-ifs and broad corporate policies. Then she opened her folder and laid out each documented instance with exacting clarity. flight numbers, dates, times, seat assignments, service omissions, witness statements, logged calls, screenshots, voice messages, crew names, reassigned bookings, and finally, a chart that displayed the frequency of these incidents in direct correlation with her appearance in first-class cabins. The room went still. The woman from the flight shifted in her seat. The legal officer cleared his throat. The vice president removed his glasses. Liana did not change her tone. She presented each point with the same calm she had used when answering client questions, when leading strategy sessions, when explaining complex deliverables to skeptical investors. There was no bitterness in her words. The fear was never in her words, but in the realization that they had dismissed not just a passenger, but a regulator, an influencer, someone who didn't scream or fight publicly because she didn't need to. They had thrown her into the shadows, assuming she had no light to cast. Now, she would open every curtain and let the air in. She left for the city's downtown legal office just after 7, wearing a storm gray dress coat over black suiting. Her pace unhurried as she moved through the glass lobby and toward the private elevator that would take her to the board-level suites. The office, neutral in tone and sound, received her with the professionalism she'd long learned to expect only in rooms where silence was expensive and truth could no longer be ignored. The legal team she met there did not ask her if the incidents were real. They did not challenge the documentation or question her memory. What they asked for, instead, were next steps. She gave them 3. First, she requested a full audit into the airline's passenger handling data from the last 18 months. Second, she initiated a formal complaint under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, citing repeated discriminatory behavior by airline staff with supporting evidence across 6 separate flights. Third, she requested a meeting be arranged between her and the Department of Transportation's Oversight Subcommittee for Aviation Ethics, a meeting which, once confirmed, would be the first step toward a larger review of national air travel conduct codes regarding racial bias. By mid-morning, her decisions had traveled further than she had anticipated. One of her contacts, an attorney embedded within federal transportation policy circles, sent her a message. The memo she submitted to the committee had not only been accepted, but forwarded internally to several division chiefs. No one had expected a case this clearly documented to arrive through internal channels rather than external media. That was by design. Liana knew too well the fatigue that came with public outrage, how quickly noise turned to silence once headlines faded. She didn't want spectacle. She wanted systemic change with teeth. Later that day, she arrived at a quiet panel held in a government building 4 blocks from Capitol Hill. She sat among colleagues in dark suits, watching as speakers discussed digital infrastructure, compliance gaps, and data ethics. Her presence was acknowledged by nods, not introductions. She preferred it that way. When her turn to speak arrived, she stood and delivered her insights into algorithmic bias with the same precision she had used to recount her travel experience. No drama, no emotion, only truth. She explained how invisible policies became weapons when wielded by employees who believed certain passengers didn't belong. She described the impact of internal flags applied disproportionately to travelers whose names sounded foreign or whose skin invited second looks. She offered case studies not as distant examples, but as lived experience. She did not say I. She did not say me, but the room understood. When the session ended, 2 representatives approached her with questions. One asked how many passengers might have experienced similar patterns without realizing it. She answered plainly, thousands. The other asked what she believed the most effective remedy would be. She replied, accountability where systems meet people. By evening, she returned home and stood once again by her window, looking out over the slow movement of cars below and the streetlights casting small pools of gold across the sidewalks. She thought about every quiet moment in the plane when she had been bypassed. The ignored drink requests, the reassigned seats, the bag taken without reason. She remembered how many times she had chosen not to speak because speaking often invited consequences worse than silence. But now, that silence had built something formidable. It had created a wall of facts impossible to dismantle with excuses. Her phone buzzed. A message from a contact at the airline. He had been in the follow-up meeting, the one held after she left the conference room with her documentation. He said one of the vice presidents had turned pale when he realized who she was. Another had asked how someone with that much influence had been allowed to slip through the cracks. The irony, of course, was that she hadn't slipped through anything. She had been pushed, repeatedly, intentionally. They hadn't just failed to see her power. They had refused to see her humanity. That refusal now carried weight. She typed a brief reply thanking the contact for the update, then placed the phone face down. Tomorrow, her name would appear on a closed-door agenda briefing circulated to the legal department, corporate relations, and external affairs for the airline. The subject line was titled Immediate Risk Containment, Compliance, and Civil Rights Violation, and her name was the first listed beneath it. She had not demanded it. She had not asked them to fear her. They had chosen that themselves. Across the city, another meeting was taking place without her. This one held in a glossy high-rise where members of the airline's senior leadership were reviewing their crisis management protocols. The focus was no longer on the flight crew, or the seating charts, or the mistaken bag. The focus was on exposure, on the silence they had relied on and how it had failed, on the face they had overlooked and the position it had concealed. A junior executive raised a question about reaching out to Liana for a conversation. The general counsel shut it down. They were past the point of casual resolutions. They were on defense now. As Liana stepped into her office at 9:15 that day, coffee in hand, the first headlines were already crawling across quiet corners of industry feeds. Anonymous regulatory filings citing Title VI violations, pending audits, unnamed airlines under review for discriminatory practices, senior staff under investigation for compliance failure. None of the articles said her name. They didn't have to. Her influence wasn't designed for spectacle. It was written into the very machinery, now waking up to its own culpability. Inside the airline's boardroom, the mood had changed. The executives who had once spoken with dismissive confidence now sat in rigid silence as their general counsel presented a list of internal complaints that had been quietly submitted following Liana's intervention. Dozens of employees had come forward not to seek justice, but to protect themselves. Flight attendants, gate supervisors, mid-level managers. Most of them hadn't known who she was, but all of them now understood what their silence had enabled. One report described a pattern of swapping first-class passengers based on appearance. Another outlined training programs that encouraged subjective assessments under the guise of customer profiling. Another listed repeated complaints about a specific crew member who had appeared on multiple flights involving passenger conflicts. His name was Curtis. Curtis, the flight attendant who had handed Liana a middle seat without flinching, now sat under direct investigation for 6 separate allegations of discriminatory behavior. 3 of the passengers had filed formal complaints, but only Liana's case had traction. Because of her, their voices were now being reviewed. Because of her, the system could no longer pretend that coincidence explained everything. The airline's human resources team scrambled to mitigate fallout, sending internal memos about training refreshers, launching expedited evaluations, and placing Curtis on unpaid leave pending review. He received the news while clocking in for a midday flight. He asked who had filed the complaint. No one answered. Meanwhile, the vice president, who had failed to report Liana's incident on the day it occurred, was summoned to a closed session with external counsel. His defense, that he hadn't known her importance, was met with disbelief, not because he had failed to recognize her title, but because he had dismissed her personhood. He tried to explain the oversight as a procedural misstep, citing high workload and limited information. But the facts were clear. He had received an email that included her full name, her status, and her original first-class confirmation. He had chosen not to escalate it. He had deleted the message the same day. IT retrieved the deletion log within minutes. He was placed on administrative leave with a review pending. By mid-afternoon, the executive director of passenger services, who had signed off on the generic apology Liana had received in the mail, was publicly reprimanded by the compliance board. Not for sending the letter, but for authorizing the dismissal of her original report as a non-actionable complaint. Her signature was on the form marked closed. Her initials confirmed receipt without investigation. When asked why she had not pursued the claim further, she answered that such reports came infrequently and rarely led to substantiated concerns. Her statement was recorded. Her access to case files was revoked. In the airline's media department, a quiet storm brewed. Requests for comment had begun to pile up from journalists who had seen the filings and tracked similarities to previous stories about racial profiling in air travel. Though Liana had not spoken to the press, the correlation between the incidents and the audit was becoming evident. Internally, staff debated whether to issue a statement or remain silent. The communications director decided silence. The CEO disagreed. By the end of the day, a carefully worded message was released to major outlets, stating that the airline was committed to reviewing all internal processes, reinforcing employee training, and cooperating fully with any external regulatory inquiries. It was bland. It was late. It satisfied no one. Back at her office, Liana met briefly with her legal team to review the next phase of compliance proceedings. The Department of Transportation had formally acknowledged receipt of her submission and had begun coordinating with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to identify potential civil rights breaches in personnel behavior. Her case, once buried beneath layers of scripted procedures, now sat at the top of the federal docket. But she wasn't celebrating. Her expression remained composed, her focus locked. Justice, to her, wasn't about punishment. It was about dismantling the structure that allowed people like her to be humiliated without witnesses or consequence. By early evening, Curtis found himself sitting in a plain office chair in a quiet room far removed from the cabins he once patrolled with authority. Across from him sat two investigators. They asked simple questions. Did he remember seat 1D? Did he remember the passenger who had been reassigned? Did he recall removing her bag without explanation? He shifted uncomfortably, claiming he had only followed instructions. They asked whose. He didn't answer. They showed him a log of recorded internal messages, one of which included his own response to a supervisor regarding someone who doesn't look like they belong in first class. He swallowed, said it had been a joke. The room did not laugh. The interview ended without ceremony. He was instructed not to return to duty until further notice. As he left the building, he noticed for the first time how quiet the terminal had become. How many colleagues now looked at him with something colder than judgment, disgust. The vice president received a letter from the board that evening. Termination was not immediate, but inevitable. He was advised to resign before the weekend or face public dismissal. He sat alone in his office, reviewing the official complaint that had sparked the collapse. He read Liana's name. Then he Googled it. When the results appeared, his breath caught. Her resume, her affiliations, her advisory roles. He realized he had never even bothered to pronounce her name correctly. Not once. That name now sat above the signature on the federal letter that would end his career. The director of passenger services wept in her car that night. She hadn't cried in years. Not over this job. Not over passengers. But this was different. She realized too late that the letter she had signed without reading had been addressed by someone powerful, someone principled, someone patient enough to watch an entire system unravel instead of screaming into it. That silence haunted her more than any angry email ever could. The morning began not with noise or announcements, not with flight schedules or reports or legal memos, but with a soft rhythm of rain sliding down the wide windows of a classroom just outside Richmond. Inside, Curtis sat near the back of the room, notebook unopened, hands loosely clasped on the desk before him. Around him sat 8 others, all dressed in similar shades of gray and black, a group that included a former gate supervisor, 2 flight attendants, 1 manager from customer service, and 1 operations analyst. They had all been required to attend this session, mandatory bias remediation and ethics restoration, a pilot program designed as part of a new partnership between the Department of Transportation and the airline. It wasn't disciplinary in name, but no one mistook it for anything else. Curtis had resisted coming. He had spent the last few weeks suspended, uncertain whether he would return to work, caught between denial and resentment. But today felt different. The instructor entered with no fanfare, a tall man with a quiet voice and a firm expression. He did not open with greetings. He opened with a question. When did we start deciding who belongs before they even speak? Curtis didn't answer, but the question landed harder than he expected. As the hours passed, he found himself listening more than reacting. He saw videos, not from the flight he had worked, but of others. Footage showing small injustices delivered in professional tones. Passengers ignored. Instructions twisted. Luggage mishandled not by accident, but by selective enforcement. The instructor didn't name names, but each scene struck something in Curtis that made the floor feel less stable beneath him. By midday, they broke into small discussion groups. When it was his turn, Curtis found himself admitting, without being prompted, that he had once moved a passenger because she looked uncomfortable to the others. He didn't say Liana's name. He didn't need to. No one interrupted. No one argued. The silence that followed was not defensive. It was contemplative. That afternoon, the instructor asked each participant to write a private letter, not to anyone in particular, not to the airline, not to their managers, but to the version of themselves who first took the job. Curtis stared at the blank page for a long time. Then, slowly, he wrote, "I wanted to be part of something people respected. I wanted to offer people comfort while they traveled, but I confused control with pride, and I let fear of difference become my compass. I saw passengers not as travelers, but as risks. I didn't understand that safety without fairness is just another word for exclusion." In another part of the city, the director of passenger services sat across from a new hire, a young woman interviewing for a role in passenger outreach. The director, once known for clipped answers and disinterest in personnel details, now asked questions about empathy, about memory, about how the applicant would respond if they saw someone seated where others thought they didn't belong. Her voice was softer than it had been months ago. Her eyes no longer scanned resumes for affiliations or alma maters, but for signs of awareness. Before the interview ended, she pulled open her drawer and handed the applicant a small printout of a training module titled Identity and Presence in Public Spaces. It was a document drafted in part by a consulting advisor who had never spoken on camera, who had never joined press panels or demanded front-page coverage, but whose influence now shaped the very way this airline defined excellence. The applicant looked at the paper, smiled, and thanked her. The director smiled back and said she hoped to see her again soon. Meanwhile, across the country, Liana stood at the front of a conference room in Los Angeles, delivering the keynote address at a summit on civil infrastructure and transportation equity. She had not planned to speak. She had not submitted a proposal or asked for the spotlight. But the committee had reached out to her after her language on passenger rights had reshaped multiple airline compliance protocols. They wanted her voice not just as a symbol of correction, but as a guide for what came next. She wore a clean white blazer, her notes minimal, her tone steady. She spoke about systems, not as enemies, but as mirrors. She described the architecture of bias as not always intentional, but always damaging. She reminded the room that silence is not neutrality, that choosing not to intervene is choosing the side of harm. She ended by saying that justice is not about retribution. It is about realignment. As she stepped down from the stage, a young man approached her in the hallway outside the ballroom. He introduced himself as a flight attendant in training, recently hired through the airline's new inclusive recruitment program. He thanked her not for speaking up, but for teaching others how to listen differently. She nodded once and said she hoped he would treat every seat like a story worth protecting. He said he would. Later that night, Liana sat on the balcony of her hotel, looking out over the city's quiet skyline. She remembered the first time she had stepped onto that plane, the weight of her carry-on, the subtle shift in the air when she was told to move. The way silence had once felt like the only way to keep control. Now, Her silence had become a lever, not to hide, but to redirect force. The damage had not been reversed, but it had been exposed. And exposure, she had learned, was not the end of dignity. It was its beginning. In a small airport lounge on the edge of the Midwest, a group of senior flight staff gathered to watch a new internal video. It featured no actors, no corporate slogans, no background music. It opened with the words, "Everyone has a right to belong." The narrator's voice was calm, deliberate. The video detailed not rules, but values. Not protocols, but choices. Every line had been written with care. The words had come from a policy document once ignored, now transformed by the person who had lived every line of it. Curtis watched the video alone at the end of his session. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. At the final frame, he sat back, breathing slowly. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel ashamed. He felt accountable. And that, he understood now, was different. Liana's story was never meant to be public, but its impact had grown without amplification. It traveled not by voice, but by echo, through flight logs, through rewritten protocols, through the way a flight attendant now greeted every passenger with eye contact and full names, through how gate agents asked questions not to judge, but to assist. The change was quiet, like her strength, but it was undeniable. Justice hadn't screamed. It had whispered. And still, the world had listened. The end. If you're feeling the impact of this story and want to see more powerful cinematic narratives like it, make sure to like and subscribe to support the journey. Your feedback helps shape the next chapters. What do you think of the plot so far? Which moment hit you the hardest? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one.